Cool. Okay, so Klementyna Gawecka is visiting from UKCEH in Edinburgh, where she's a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow working with Professor James Bullock. Her current research explores the responses of ecological communities to environmental changes with a focus on species interactions and understanding the consequences of habitat loss and restoration. Before joining the world of ecology, Klementyna did a master's and PhD in civil and environmental engineering, both at Imperial College London. Her growing interest in ecology and conservation made her pursue another master's, this time in quantitative environmental sciences at the University of Zurich, and her research combines engineering and ecological theory to answer complex ecological problems.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and be able to share some of my work with you today. So today I want to talk to you about how ecological communities respond to habitat change. And I will start with the doom and gloom, so habitat destruction, unfortunately. So as I'm sure you all know, it's the major cause of the biodiversity crisis, or one of the major causes of biodiversity crisis, and we're losing natural environments at very, very fast rates, mainly due to our human activities. So this could be caused kind of by our direct activities like agricultural expansion and urbanization and mining and so on. But it could also be through our indirect actions. So, for example, climate change can make habitats uninhabitable. And I mean, coral bleaching is probably one of the most obvious examples here. Well, natural environments can also kind of be destroyed naturally, so by processes like fires or storms. But again, our activities seem to be intensifying these events. But well, whatever the cause of destruction is, what it usually results is not only the loss of habitat, but also its fragmentations. So large areas of pristine habitat are being divided into many small fragments. So we have small populations of species inhabiting these small habitat fragments. And these populations are very prone to extinctions. So understanding the consequences of habitat loss and fragmentation is really important for understanding persistence of these species in these fragmented landscapes. And metapopulation theory is actually really useful here for understanding the persistence of these species in these fragmented landscapes. So here we have a very simple cartoon. We have a landscape with patches of habitat, and at a given time, some of these patches might be occupied, so might contain a population of species, like this one here or this one here, but also some might be empty at a given time. And with time, this might change. So the empty patches might become colonized by species, by individuals dispersing from the occupied patches. But then patches that used to be occupied the species might go extinct locally. And this might happen because these populations might be small, there might be high demographic stochasticity, so extinction sort of happen by chance. But still, so even though we have kind of high temporal variability at the patch scale, at the landscape scale, what's important is that this metapopulation, so the collection of all the populations, still persists. And understanding this balance between the colonization and extinction events is basically really important for understanding how entire metapopulations persist in landscapes. Now, of course, species don't exist in isolation, but in any habitat patch, there'll be an entire community of species, and these species will interact together. So they will affect each other, whether it's through kind of competition or antagonistic or mutualistic interactions. So they will affect each other both within the patch, but also across the landscape by affecting each other's dispersal. And a really useful way of representing these communities or meta communities is using network theory. So here we have a network, and the nodes here of this network represent species. So just an example here. And then the links represent the interactions between those species. And this approach is really useful, for example, for understanding how changes in one species can propagate through the entire community. So let's say, for example, we could remove one species, so simulate its extinction, and we can see which other species go extinct because they depend on that species. So we can essentially identify species that are very important for the persistence of the entire community and preventing and prevent them from collapsing. So network theory has actually very many practical applications, especially in kind of conservation biology or ecology. And then the other interesting application of network theory is to do with the landscape. So we can represent the landscape, again, as a network where the nodes represent habitat patches and the links possible dispersal routes between the patches. And again, we could, for example, study how the overall connectivity of the landscape changes if we remove a patch. So we can identify patches which, for example, which are very important for the connectivity of the landscape, just by looking at the structure of this network. So this basically these two kind of applications of network have been used in understanding basically how species persist in these fragmented landscapes. And this has been studied by many people before, but I want to start with this kind of very simple example of a very simple model. So here we have a landscape that we're discretizing into patches, and it's a regular grid of patches where each patch is connected to its 4 nearest neighbors. And this landscape is inhabited by a metapopulation. So we're going to start with just a single species, so ignore for now interactions. And what we're going to do here is we're going to destroy the habitat, the landscape, in steps by selecting patches at random and changing their state from pristine to destroyed. So pristine patches are patches where a population can persist, they can be occupied, and destroyed patches cannot be colonized. They don't contain the suitable kind of habitat for species to persist, population to persist. So what we do is that at each step, we're going to simulate these extinction and colonization dynamics, and we're going to measure how many patches are occupied at each step. And this is what I'm plotting here. So this is the fraction of occupied patches. So as we destroy habitat, as we increase the fraction of habitat loss, patch occupancy reduces. Now, this is partly because simply we have less available habitat, right? But what's interesting is that at the intermediate and higher fractions of habitat loss, this reduction in occupancy becomes nonlinear. So it means that we're losing occupancy, we're reducing occupancy quicker than we are losing habitat. And this is the effect of not just habitat loss, but its fragmentation. So although we might have some pristine habitat patches in the landscape, they might be so disconnected from the rest of the landscape that they cannot be colonized anymore. So we end up with lower occupancy than we could possibly have based on the amount of habitat. And as we continue to destroy habitat, at some point the entire metapopulation becomes extinct. So patch occupancy reduces to 0. And at this point, this fraction of habitat loss, when that happens, is what we call the extinction threshold. And what's really interesting here, what comes out from these very simple models, is that this extinction happens before we destroy all the habitat. So even though we still have available habitat in the landscape, it might not be enough to sustain a metapopulation. And despite this simplicity of this model, I mean, these are quite important implications for conservation. And perhaps the most famous example showing the power of these types of model is the case of the northern spotted owl. So this owl inhabits old-growth forest in the northwest US, and up until the 80s, these forests were very heavily logged and very little of them remained. And a similar model was developed to calculate, to estimate this extinction threshold for this owl. And what it showed was that if any more forest is cut down, the owl will become extinct. And this actually, so the results of this model actually led to this owl being listed as a threatened species, and also significant changes in the forestry practices. So yes, this is probably my favorite example showing how a really simple model can be very impactful in conservation. But so far, well, we destroyed the habitat in kind of a random sequence. So we selected patches at random and destroyed them. So the pattern, the spatial pattern of habitat loss was what I call uncorrelated, spatially uncorrelated. But of course, we could destroy habitat in many different ways. So here we looked at another scenario where we destroyed patches in clusters. We had connected clusters of connected patches, and we destroyed them. And this is what I'll be calling the spatially correlated habitat loss. And again, we simulate this progressive destruction. And now here I'm plotting persistence versus fraction of habitat loss. Now, persistence here is a measure that we used, that it encompasses many simulations and many species parameters, but conceptually it's kind of similar to the fraction of occupied patches. So as we destroy the habitats, again, we see this nonlinear reduction in persistence or patch occupancy. And this is firstly with the random spatial uncorrelated habitat loss. But now if we destroy patches in clusters, we see that we actually get much higher persistence, especially at high fractions of habitat loss. So what happens here is that even when the habitat fragments, so when we have very little available habitat, these pristine remnant areas are still clustered together. And this is actually enough to sustain a motor population. So in this scenario, the species we can say they're very robust to this spatially correlated habitat loss. Now, this was all on a kind of a very regular grid, very idealized grid landscape. But of course, the spatial networks can look differently depending on the landscape topology. Dispersal pathways might be different, and patches might be connected in different ways. So what we did is we constructed two other spatial networks, so landscape networks. So in the first one, we had this random network. We connected patches at random, as the name suggests. But what happened is that we had still an average of 4 connections per node. But now some patches had fewer and some had more connections. And then in the scale-free network, again, we still had 4 connections per node on average, but we had many patches with only 1 connection, and very few patches with many, which were very highly connected. So on this picture here, the node size is proportional to how many connections it has. You can see that here. But essentially, as we go from left to right, we're increasing the heterogeneity in the distribution of connections between patches. So here, all patches are effectively identical because they all have 4 connections, whereas here, there's a large difference between the most and the least connected. And now we're going to simulate habitat destruction exactly the same way, but on these different networks. And what we see, firstly, is that in this random network, we see that species respond similarly to both type of habitat loss patterns. So they're not particularly robust to either correlated or uncorrelated habitat loss. But in the scale-free network, we see, well, first we see much higher persistence in these networks, baseline persistence. But also we see that these networks are very robust to the spatially uncorrelated habitat loss, so the gray box plots. And this is actually opposite to what happens in the grid landscapes, right? So what happens here is that if we're removing patches at random, we're very likely to remove these poorly connected patches simply because there's so many of them. And these patches are not that important for the overall landscape connectivity. And that's why these networks are very robust to removal of these nodes. But in the spatially correlated habitat loss, where we remove kind of connected patches, clusters of connected patches, we're very likely to quickly remove one of these really important highly connected nodes. And this fragments the whole network very quickly. And then the species persistence reduces very quickly because of this fragmentation. So analyzing network structure, or the structure of the landscape network, can be really useful for kind of giving us some idea of how robust it might be to habitat loss, and also for kind of picking out which patches might be more important and perhaps prioritizing protection of these highly connected patches, right? Now, you might wonder why I have box plots in this plot. And that's because we actually run these simulations with a whole meta-community of species, or actually multiple meta-communities, rather than just a single species. And what we did is, so we ran many simulations, each with a different meta-community. And I should say here that here we focus on communities of mutualistic interactions. So these will be, for example, plants and their pollinators, or plants and the seed dispersers. And what we found was that two properties of this interaction network affected persistence, in their persistence. So first one was the connectance. So this is the density of connections in a network. And second is nestedness. So nestedness is a property where we have a core group of generalist species interacting with other generalists, and also with specialists, whereas the specialists interact only with the generalists. So it's a very common pattern in mutualistic communities, mutualistic systems, and it's been shown to promote biodiversity and also stability in these communities. And what we find is that these two properties increase persistence and robustness of these meta-communities to habitat loss. So again, this could be really useful because you given a community, an interaction network, by analyzing its structure, we can start to have an idea of how robust it might be to destruction of habitat, future destruction of habitat, and then we might prioritize protection or conservation accordingly. Okay, so just to recap this part, so we saw that species need a minimum amount of connected habitat to persist, and that this depends on their kind of colonization potential and local extinction risk. And we also saw that the spatial landscape structure and habitat loss patterns are very tightly interlinked. So there's a close relationship between the two. So we found that, for example, heterogeneous networks, so these scale-free networks, are very robust to random habitat loss, but they fragment very easily when we remove the highly connected patches. And lastly, meta-community structure. So who interacts with whom is also really important for persistence. And again, these highly connected and nested networks are really beneficial for persistence. So overall, what this shows is that both the spatial patterns and also the patterns of interactions between species, I think they should be important considerations in kind of conservation of communities. Be a little bit more optimistic because it's all about restoring habitats, so reversing all the negative, all the damage done through habitat destruction. And I mean, I'm sure you know this idea is really gaining a lot of momentum at the moment. and it's a lot of public interest, but also kind of global initiatives like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and also national schemes that are setting out targets to restore degraded ecosystems. So yeah, so there's a huge rise in restoration and rewild projects, I mean, especially here in Scotland. So I think now is definitely the time to restore. But I think the question is, how do we do it in kind of sustainable and effective way? So how and where do we restore so that biodiversity actually recovers and it remains resilient? And I think these questions are quite difficult to answer. One reason is that, as we just saw in the first half of this talk, species persistence depends on so many things like landscape structure and species interactions, just to name a few. But I think these kind of simple models can help us start to disentangle these complex mechanisms. And I think they can give us some really interesting insights into this problem. So I'm now going to go back to our simple model with a grid-like landscape. So again, this regular landscape with patches connected to its neighbors. And now we're going to first destroy the landscape, but then restore it by changing the state of the patches back to pristine. And we're going to do it at different levels of destruction. So here again, we have the fraction of occupied patches against habitat loss. And this gray line shows how it reduces as we destroy the habitat, right? So you're very familiar with this kind of nonlinear reduction already. But now we're going to restore habitat once we had destroyed 40% of the landscape. So here, as we restore habitat, the species occupancy increases. And here we see that this path followed during restoration is the same as during destruction. So this process is reversible. But now, let's see what happens if we start restoring at 70% habitat loss. So here we see that species occupancy does recover if we restore most of the landscape. But at the initial stages of restoration, occupancy during restoration is lower than during destruction for the same fraction of available habitat, right? Now, in other words, if we want to reach a certain occupancy that we saw pre-restoration, we might have to restore more habitat than we destroyed. And this happens because we are restoring patches in kind of a random sequence. So we might end up with a pristine patch that's somewhere on the periphery of the landscape and is still disconnected from the rest of the landscape, and therefore it cannot be recolonized. So basically we have this lag between the amount of available habitat and the amount that's actually colonizable. And what we did is we quantified this lag as this area between the two curves, and we compared it across many different scenarios that we simulated. And what we found was that the magnitude of this lag depends mainly on three things. So firstly, the amount of destroyed habitat. So the more habitat was destroyed before we restore, the larger this lag, and essentially the less efficient restoration becomes. But secondly, meta-community structure. So again, we saw these large and well-connected and nested communities have much lower lags than small, poorly connected and modular communities. So here modularity is a pattern sort of opposite to nestedness, where we have groups of species interacting together, but there were very little interactions between the distinct groups. And then thirdly, the spatial restoration pattern. So again, we restored patches either in a random sequence, this is the uncorrelated restoration pattern, or in clusters, starting around areas of already existing pristine areas. And we found that this correlated pattern, again, had smaller lags. So the take-home message here is that we should restore areas which are adjacent, or at least start restoring areas which are adjacent to kind of these remnant pristine areas. And also, again, meta-community structure. So who interacts with whom really matters for how efficiently communities recover. Now, so far I kind of focused on mutualistic communities, So this is where recovery of one guild of species will benefit the other and vice versa. But of course, in communities that have kind of more competitive or antagonistic interactions, this is not the case. So recovery of one species can actually be detrimental to the other. So what we did in this last study I want to show you is we had 3 insect communities. And these were, so we focused on food webs here, so trophic interactions, and how their complexity affects recovery species. And I might surprise you because this was an experiment. So for me as a mainly theoretical ecologist, this is very exciting. But yeah, so we had these 3 communities, and in the first community, we had a single aphid species feeding on a radish plant. So the individuals were competing with each other for resources. So we have intra-specific competition. Then in the second community, we added another aphid species, and it was a better competitor. So now we have interspecific competition as well. And then in the last community, we added a parasitoid wasp, which lays eggs inside the aphids and effectively kills them, so controls their population. And then we had our patchy landscapes. So here we have plastic containers, each representing a habitat patch. And we connected these, so we had 5 containers and we connected them in a star arrangement. So we had 1 central patch and then 4 peripheral patches, which were directly connected to the central one. And what we did was we put each of these communities in this landscape one at a time, and we observed how they grow, how they colonize the landscape, and so how the population, metapopulation changes depending on the community. So we counted aphids across all habitat patches, and so the kind of evolution of metapopulation size of one aphid might look something like this. And what we did is we summarized this, what I call recovery trajectory, by calculating the area under this curve. And I will refer to this as the recovery credit. And what this measure essentially summarizes is it's kind of like a cumulative measure of abundance through time. And I'm going to compare this recovery credit for one aphid species across the 3 communities. So as we increase community complexity, as we add more species, recovery credit reduces. Now, this is not perhaps the most surprising because we are essentially adding more competition and parasitism. So these are all negative effects on our aphid, focal aphid species. So this is not perhaps surprising, but I think what it demonstrates is that recovery can be a bit of a balancing act, because on one hand, we do want these more complex and species and interaction-rich communities because they tend to be more resilient and they function better. But what this shows is that actually recovery of species within these communities can be slower. So we might need to be either more patient, or we might need to think carefully how we introduce species, in what order we introduce species. So perhaps letting the lower trophic levels or the poorer competitors established first before we add anything else. Now, this is not quite the end of the story because, as you probably guessed, I like models, so I couldn't stop there. And my problem was that these experimental communities are still pretty simple. I mean, three species, it's not that complex. So what we did, we built this model, meta-community model, which describes the evolution of aphid abundance through time. And it accounts for intrinsic growth, for the competition and parasitism, and also the spatial dynamics, so immigration and emigration between patches. And we parameterized this model for our specific insects, and we were quite happy because it reproduced this model. That's weird. The model reproduced the experimental results pretty well. So this gave us confidence to kind of use this model to then extrapolate the experiment to slightly more complex communities. And this should be the second community with two species. So the fourth box plot here now shows a community where we added another aphid species. So we had three aphid species competing against each other. And then in the last box plot, we have a community where we have two aphids, the parasitoid wasp, and also a hyperparasitoid wasp. And this hyperparasitoid lays eggs inside the parasitized larvae inside the aphids. Slightly disturbing, but yeah, that's what happens. Pretty cool. So what we see here, actually, relative to this three species community that we had in the experiment, recovery credit increases. And this is, well, because of many indirect effects that we have. So for example, with the hyperparasitoid reduces abundance of the parasitoid. Fewer parasitoids means more aphids. So recovery of aphids increases or is boosted. And so effectively, the hyperparasitoid has a positive indirect effect on the aphid, right? And in kind of large and species-rich communities, what happens is that we tend to have more of these indirect effects. So what this means is, well, the more complex the community, so if we go beyond these communities, kind of the more unpredictable recovery can be. But potentially we can also kind of improve it, depending on the community context. But there is kind of room for improving recovery through these indirect effects. So just to kind of sum up this part. So again, space really matters for recovery. So we saw that recovery in highly degraded landscapes can be kind of less efficient. So spatial planning becomes very important there. And we found that restoring patches adjacent to kind of already established pristine areas is more effective. And then, of course, meta-community structure again matters. So in ritualistic communities, these species-rich, well-connected and nested communities recover much more easily. And then in the trophic communities, we see that low complexity could potentially reduce recovery. But then potentially if we have very high species richness in interaction, especially richness, then that has actually potential of boosting recovery species. Okay, so I guess what I wanted to mainly show you today is that simple models can give us some really interesting insights into quite complex problems. I think they can really help us kind of disentangle mechanisms and really kind of dissect the problem and see which part of the problem is really important. And I think these insights can then kind of lead into actual design, helping us design ecological and conservation and restoration schemes. But I also think that combining lab and field experiments can be very valuable. So, for example, experimental observations can feed into the model to improve its realism so that we can be kind of more confident in what the model predicts. But then also the model can help us, it can generate hypotheses that we can test experimentally and potentially even as well help us designing the experiment itself, so the experimental design. So I think this integrative approach of combining field and lab experiments and models as well, I think that's really a really interesting and kind of way forward. And I think it can really have a kind of impact on ecological design. So we can get some really interesting insights from this integrative approach. So yeah, on that note, I'll just like to thank you for your attention. I acknowledge my collaborators and my funding, but I mostly thank you for being here on this very sunny day. Happy to answer any questions and also welcome any suggestions always. And yeah, feel free to get in touch as well.
Thank you. Any questions for Klementyna? Yes, Sam.
I've got so many. I want to ask you the fun one.
Yeah.
Fun one.
Yeah.
Fun one.
If you were to be given a massive grant to scale up that experiment that you did, really cool experiment, what would you potentially love to do with like millions of pounds?
Ooh. I think it would be really cool to set up. This was all done in a climate chamber in a greenhouse, a very constrained space. So I think it would be really cool to take it to field, kind of build mesh cages which can contain insects, but then put lots of insects in there. So really complex communities, and then have a gradient in complexity, not just from 2 to 5 species, but from 1 to like 100 species. I think that would be really, really interesting. And then incorporate space as well. Sorry, landscape. Space and interactions are my 2 obsessions. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, that was really fascinating.
Oh, wow.
I had a question also about that experiment. I guess what I was wondering is where you're looking at the response of one species to the recovery. Do you think that the response is in any way species specific there, or would you say the same if you think like the main response overall of the species as you would?
Yeah, so yeah, really good question. So I'm looking at the aphids, so a herbivore, and what? So I did the same analysis for both species of aphids. So we had two aphids in the experiment. One was a better competitor than the other, so there are differences between them, but qualitatively, the results were the same. So the other aphid had, because it was a better competitor, had high abundances, but the effect of complexity was the same. Now, of course, if we were to look at higher trophic levels, so like the parasitoid wasps, it will have a very different response for sure. So yeah, I think it's definitely trophic level specific. Perhaps at the same trophic level, maybe the differences are not as substantial. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
I was wondering what parasitoid system and we know Anderson Wells data.
If I know, sorry.
The Anderson Wells data set.
Good questions. The aphids were cabbage aphid and turnip aphid, I think. I should know the Latin names, and I don't. I need to look up the preprint. And so yeah, so they feed mostly on brassica plants. Yeah. So that's why we use radish. This was done in Switzerland, so they're very, very common in Switzerland. Yeah. I would assume they're pretty common here, at least in my garden. Yeah. All my roses are infested with aphids. Don't know if it's the same species, but yeah. And then the name of the parasitoid, I don't remember, sorry.
It was something that was like commercially available.
Yes, it was. So we collected it from the field, but it is also commercially available. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting to think about. So obviously a lot of aphids are protected by symbiotics from parasitoids. So that's potentially another level of complexity you could add in.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Relationship with Hamilton and Regiella.
Okay.
So yeah, well,
yeah.
Adding complexity. Yeah, and those are super important.
Thank you. That's really cool. I haven't thought of that. So
yeah,
that's...
and hopefully it's something that's easy to do because they just naturally vary what they have.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Becky works on wasps and things. So
I'm going
to experiment.
Yeah.
She's a good person to chat.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions?
We can talk.
Oh God, we're well.
Yeah, I was just wondering with the habitats each had a certain number. If you would call it like changing the quality of connections and thinking about real examples where like a corridor of woodland is different to a hedgerow.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really cool direction. We could, you could take this in. I haven't done that. But yeah, for sure, habitat quality is such a big. It's so important. I mean, in our models, we ignored it. So we kind of said, it's either pristine or not pristine. but yeah, I think that would be really interesting, kind of another level of complexity to add to these models for sure.
I'll see if I can narrow the question as best as I can. Have you considered also considering new species coming into this trophic structure along with the changes on the habitat? So, for example, deforestation changes in current habitat, but also suitable for new species colonize that might affect the trophic structure.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. No. Yeah. Again, we haven't done that, but I think it would be really, really interesting because, yeah, for sure it happens in real life, and it must have huge impacts on, on the whole community and meta community. So I think it would be really interesting to add that in. Thanks.
Anyone else? I was just wondering, so seeing the models, you're sort of simulating the meta populations, you say it's based on real species. What sort of information do you need about those species? Like sort of, is it like dispersal traits or stuff, or how they move around?
Yeah, so with these models, so these are kind of patch occupancy models, so patches either occupied or not, it doesn't tell us anything about how big that population is. It's just whether it's present or absent. So these models are based on colonization and extinction potential. So the only parameters that go in there is colonization probability and extinction probability. So these are not the easiest parameters to obtain. So that's why these models tend to be used kind of more in a more abstract and kind of theoretical studies, more to see what the trends and mechanisms are, rather than for like a specific species. But it can be done. So for example, Ilka Hansky, the father of metapopulation theory, he did a lot of stuff on one species of butterfly, and he parameterized these models, and he showed that it reproduces what he observed back in Finland. So I think it can be done. It's just, I guess, getting that information for the extinction risk and colonization potential. It can be a bit of like an abstract, I guess, quantity to measure.
Cool. Anyone else? Let's just check on. Let's have a look. Is anyone? So there's no one in the chat. Klementyna will be hanging about for a couple of hours. We'll just be in the coffee room if anyone wants to come and chat some more about it. But, yeah.